December 16th, 1944. If General George Smith Patton hadn't seen what was coming, 80,000 United States soldiers would have been slaughtered in the snow. Not defeated, not captured, slaughtered. While every other Allied commander sat comfortable in their headquarters, believing the war was nearly won, one man stood alone with a terrifying prediction. They called him Old Blood and Guts, a name earned through years of leading from the front, charging into battle while other generals commanded from miles behind the lines. And on this frozen morning in the Ardennes forest, George Smith Patton was about to prove why his instincts were sharper than any intelligence report ever written. What he predicted seemed impossible. What he prepared for seemed insane. But when hell erupted in the Belgian woods and 200,000 German soldiers came screaming out of the fog, only one man wasn't surprised. This is the story of how Old Blood and Guts saw the future and saved an army. This is what happened next. The autumn of 1944 had intoxicated the Allied High Command with victory. Paris liberated, Brussels freed, the German army retreating on all fronts. In the ornate headquarters scattered across France and Belgium, British and United States generals studied maps with champagne optimism. The war would be over by Christmas. Hitler was finished. Nazi Germany was collapsing. But General George Smith Patton didn't believe it. While his fellow commanders celebrated, Old Blood and Guts stared at his maps with growing unease. His Third Army had been driving east through France like a knife through butter. But something felt wrong. The German retreat seemed too organized, too deliberate. Intelligence reports showed enemy units disappearing from the front lines, but nobody knew where they were going. "They're planning something," Patton told his staff officers in early December. "Something big." His aides exchanged glances. The boss was being paranoid again. Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force intelligence showed no German offensive capability. The Wehrmacht was broken, scattered, running out of fuel and ammunition. What could they possibly be planning? George Smith Patton pointed at the Ardennes forest on his map, that dense mountainous woodland straddling the border between Belgium, Luxembourg, and Germany. The same forest the Germans had punched through in 1940 during their conquest of France. "Here," Old Blood and Guts said, his finger stabbing the map. "They'll hit us here." It was tactically logical, Patton explained. The Ardennes sector was lightly defended, held mostly by Green United States divisions fresh from America or exhausted units recuperating from heavy combat. The dense forest would neutralize Allied air superiority. The terrain channeled any attack toward Antwerp, the vital port through which most Allied supplies flowed. Cut off Antwerp, and you split, with the British and United States armies in two. "If I were the German commander," George Smith Patton said, "this is exactly where I'd attack." But nobody was listening. Supreme Headquarters dismissed his concerns. British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, commanding forces to the north, called the idea preposterous. Even United States General Omar Bradley, Patton's immediate superior, thought Old Blood and Guts was seeing ghosts. "George, you're tired," Bradley said during a meeting in early December. "The Germans are finished. They don't have the strength for a major offensive." Patton's jaw tightened. They thought he was being reckless again, seeing enemy threats that didn't exist. But George Smith Patton had been fighting Germans since North Africa. He'd studied their doctrine, battled their best commanders, learned to think like them, and every instinct in his warrior's soul screamed that something terrible was coming. "Mark my words, Old Blood." And Guts told his staff on December 10th, "We'll be fighting for our lives in that forest before Christmas." Still, Supreme Headquarters refused to reinforce the Ardennes. They had other priorities. Montgomery wanted more troops for his drive into northern Germany. The supply situation was strained. Winter weather was grounding aircraft. And besides, German prisoners were surrendering by the thousands. Why worry about an offensive from a defeated enemy? But George Smith Patton did more than worry. He prepared. Without authorization from higher headquarters, Old Blood and Guts began quietly positioning his Third Army for a rapid turn north. He ordered staff officers to draw up contingency plans for attacking into the Ardennes from the south. He positioned supply dumps along roads leading north. He studied the terrain, memorized the road networks, calculated movement times. When they hit, Patton told his operations officer, "We're going to hit them back, hard, fast, before anyone else even knows what's happening." His staff thought he was crazy. The Third Army was preparing for its own offensive driving east toward the German border. Why waste time planning for a phantom German attack that would never come? December 12th, 4 days before the storm, General George Smith Patton gathered his corps commanders and delivered orders that stunned them. He wanted 3 separate contingency plans drawn up immediately. Plans for the Third Army to wheel 90 degrees north and attack into the Ardennes with 6 divisions. 3 different plans depending on where the German attack hit hardest. "Sir, we're supposed to be attacking east," one general protested. "Supreme Headquarters has approved our offensive for December 19th. "Plans change," Old Blood and Guts said coldly. "Get me those contingency plans. 72 hours. They scrambled to obey. You didn't argue with George Smith Patton when that steel came into his voice. December 15th, 1 day before hell, Patton visited forward units near the German border, peering through binoculars at the enemy positions. Unnaturally quiet. Too quiet. German artillery had gone silent. No probing attacks, no patrol activity. The kind of quiet that comes before a hurricane. That night, Old Blood and Guts barely slept. He paced his headquarters, studying maps by lamplight, chain-smoking cigars. His pearl-handled revolvers gleamed on his desk, the weapons that had become his trademark, symbols of a warrior who led from the front. "Tomorrow," he told his aide. "It's coming tomorrow." But Old Blood and Guts was about to change history. December 16th, 1944, 5:30 in the morning. The Ardennes forest exploded. 2,000 German artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously along an 80-mile front. In the darkness before dawn, shells rained down on sleeping United States positions. Searchlights bounced off low clouds, creating artificial daylight. Then came the tanks, hundreds of them, smashing through the snow-covered forest. Behind them, 200,000 German soldiers, Hitler's last great gamble, the largest German offensive since 1940. Communication lines were cut. Entire United States regiments were overrun before they could radio for help. In the chaos and confusion, nobody at Supreme Headquarters understood what was happening. Scattered reports filtered in. Something about a German attack, maybe a local counteroffensive, probably nothing serious. But in his headquarters in Nancy, France, General George Smith Patton knew exactly what was happening. "They did it," Old Blood and Guts said grimly, reading the first fragmentary reports. "The bastards actually did it." While Supreme Headquarters scrambled to understand the scope of the attack, George Smith Patton was already moving. He ordered his staff to activate the contingency plans they'd prepared. He alerted his corps commanders to stand by for new orders. He positioned his army to strike north, but first, he had to convince Supreme Headquarters to let him do it. December 19th, 3 days after the German attack. The emergency conference at Verdun would become legendary in United States military history. Supreme Commander General Dwight Eisenhower summoned his senior commanders to assess the crisis and plan a response. The situation was catastrophic. The Germans had punched a bulge 50 miles deep into Allied lines, hence the battle's name, the Battle of the Bulge. Thousands of United States soldiers were surrounded. Critical road junctions were threatened. The port of Antwerp was in danger. General George Smith Patton walked into that conference room like a man who'd been proven right and wasn't going to be gracious about it. Eisenhower looked exhausted. Montgomery looked stunned. Bradley looked sick with worry. Other generals shuffled papers with shaking hands, trying to comprehend the disaster unfolding in the Ardennes. "Gentlemen," Eisenhower began, his voice grave, "we face the most serious crisis since D-Day. The present situation is to be regarded as one of opportunity for us, and not of disaster." Some of the generals stared at him like he'd gone mad. Opportunity? The Germans were winning. Then Eisenhower turned to George Smith Patton. "George, I want you to take command of this battle from the south. How soon can you attack?" The room fell silent. Everyone knew the Third Army was 100 miles south of the fighting, heavily engaged in its own operations around the Saar region, pointing east, not north. To disengage from battle, turn 90 degrees, move 100 miles through winter weather, and attack into a different battle would take weeks, maybe a month. Old Blood and Guts didn't hesitate. "December 22nd, Patton said. 3 days, I'll attack with 3 divisions. The room erupted. Impossible. Insane. British officers literally laughed. Even United States generals who knew George Smith Patton's reputation thought he'd finally lost his mind. You couldn't move an entire Army Corps 100 miles through winter weather in 72 hours. You couldn't disengage from active combat, reorient, and launch a coordinated attack in 3 days. The logistics alone were impossible. "George," Eisenhower said carefully, "please think about what you're saying. This isn't a raid. I need a major, coordinated offensive to break through to the surrounded forces at Bastogne." Bastogne, the key road junction where the United States 101st Airborne Division and parts of the 10th Armored Division were surrounded by 5 German divisions, holding a vital crossroads that controlled the southern shoulder of the German advance. If Bastogne fell, the Germans could pour reinforcements west toward the Meuse River and Antwerp. General George Smith Patton pulled a worn notebook. From his jacket, the contingency plans he'd ordered prepared 2 weeks earlier, the plans everyone had thought were a waste of time. "I've already drawn up the movement orders," Old Blood and Guts said, holding up the notebook. "I have 3 plans depending on where you want me to strike. I can hit them here, here, or here." His finger stabbed the map 3 times. "My staff officers are standing by at 3rd Army headquarters waiting for my call. The movement can begin within 6 hours of your order." The British officers stopped laughing. The room went dead silent. "You've already planned this?" Eisenhower asked slowly. 2 weeks ago, George Smith Patton said, "when I predicted they'd attack in the Ardennes. Some of you may remember that meeting. The dig wasn't subtle. Patton had warned them. They hadn't listened. Now, United States soldiers were dying in the snow because nobody believed Old Blood and Guts when he'd seen the future." Montgomery finally spoke, his British accent dripping with skepticism. "General Patton, you're proposing to disengage from battle around the Saar, move the 3rd Army north through winter weather on icy roads, cross Luxembourg, and attack the southern flank of a German offensive with sufficient force to break through to Bastogne in 3 days. This is fantasy." George Smith Patton turned to face the British Field Marshal, his eyes blazing. "I don't deal in fantasies, Montgomery. I deal in results. You give me the order, and I'll have my divisions rolling north within hours. 72 hours from now, I'll be fighting Germans in the Ardennes. 96 hours from now, I'll break through to Bastogne." "Impossible," another general muttered. "Only if you don't have the guts to try," Old Blood and Guts shot back. Eisenhower held up his hand for silence. He studied his most aggressive, most controversial, most brilliant field commander. George Smith Patton was many things: profane, glory-seeking, politically incorrect, impossible to control. But the man delivered victories, always. "George," Eisenhower said quietly, "if you fail, those men in Bastogne will die. All of them. And the German breakthrough could reach the Meuse River." "I won't fail," General George Smith Patton said with absolute certainty. "I never fail." The room held its breath. The fate of thousands of United States soldiers hung on this decision. The entire Allied campaign hung on whether one general, Old Blood and Guts himself, could do the impossible. Eisenhower made his decision. Do it. Attack December 22nd. Break through to Bastogne. God help us all if you can't. George Smith Patton snapped a salute. "I'll be in Bastogne by Christmas. That's a promise." He strode out of the conference room and immediately telephoned his headquarters. His chief of staff answered on the first ring. "We're going north," Patton barked into the phone. "Plan 2, execute immediately. I want divisions moving within 6 hours. No delays, no excuses. We have an appointment in Bastogne, and by God, we're going to keep it." He hung up and turned to his aide. "Get me to the front. Old Blood and Guts is going to lead this attack personally." But could Old Blood and Guts really pull it off? The next 72 hours would tell. What happened next would be studied in military academies for generations. The most audacious military maneuver in United States Army history. Within 6 hours of George Smith Patton's phone call, the 3rd Army began to move. Not just move, transform itself in mid-battle. Entire divisions disengaged from combat around the Saar, pulled back from their positions, turned 90 degrees north, and started rolling toward Luxembourg and the Ardennes. The scale was staggering. 133,000 combat soldiers, 11,000 vehicles. hundreds of tanks and artillery pieces, all moving through one of the worst winters Europe had seen in decades, on roads covered with ice and snow, through darkness, because Old Blood and Guts ordered movement to continue 24 hours a day. "Keep them moving," Patton bellowed at his staff officers. "I don't care if they have to push the tanks. I don't care if they march all night. We have men dying in Bastogne, and we're going to save them." General George Smith Patton drove himself up and down the columns, his jeep sliding on icy roads, stopping to exhort exhausted soldiers trudging through the snow. "Move it, boys!" Old Blood and Guts would shout. "Your brothers are surrounded at Bastogne. They're counting on us. Are we going to let them down?" "No, sir," the soldiers would roar back, finding energy they didn't know they had. This is why they called him Old Blood and Guts. He didn't command from a comfortable headquarters. He led from the front, sharing the cold and the exhaustion and the danger. His soldiers worshipped him for it. The German high command watched in disbelief. How was this possible? How could an entire United States Army Corps disengage, reorient, and attack in just days? It violated every principle of military logistics. Their intelligence officers studied captured maps and concluded George Smith Patton had gone insane. "He's attempting the impossible," one German general told his staff. "Let him try. Winter and distance will destroy his attack before we need to fight him." But they didn't understand Old Blood and Guts. They didn't know that George Smith Patton had studied military history since childhood, that he'd read about ancient Roman forced marches and Napoleon's lightning campaigns. They didn't know he'd prepared for this exact scenario weeks in advance. They didn't know that impossible was a word that didn't exist in his vocabulary. December 20th. 48 hours before the scheduled attack, the first elements of the Third Army crossed into Luxembourg, racing toward their jump-off positions. But everything was going wrong. The weather worsened. Temperatures plummeted below zero. Roads became sheets of ice. Vehicles slid off into ditches. Fuel trucks couldn't keep up with advancing columns. Artillery pieces broke down in the cold. And then the intelligence reports came in. The Germans had 5 divisions surrounding Bastogne now, maybe 6. They were pounding the encircled garrison day and night. How long could the defenders hold? George Smith Patton gathered his commanders on the night of December 20th for a final briefing before the attack. They met in a freezing schoolhouse in Luxembourg, breath visible in the frigid air, studying maps by lamplight. "Gentlemen," Old Blood and Guts began, "tomorrow we attack. Not to contain the German offensive, not to slow them down, to destroy them. The 4th Armored Division will lead the assault, driving straight north toward Bastogne. The 26th and 80th Infantry Divisions will attack on the flanks, protecting our advance. We will punch through whatever the Germans have, and we will reach those men in Bastogne." One of his division commanders spoke up. "General, intelligence estimates 5 German divisions between us and Bastogne. We'll be outnumbered 3-1 at the point of attack." "Good," General George Smith Patton said with a wolf's grin. "Then we'll have them surrounded." The officers laughed despite their exhaustion. That was pure Patton, turning a disadvantage into a joke, into motivation, into fighting spirit. "Listen to me," Old Blood and Guts continued, his voice dropping low and intense. "This isn't just another battle. This is about saving 10,000 surrounded Americans who are facing annihilation. This is about showing the Germans they can't surprise us, can't stop us, can't beat us. This is about proving the United States Army is the finest fighting force on God's green earth. And gentlemen, we're going to prove it in 72 hours. He paused, looking each commander in the eye. "Tomorrow morning, 4th Armored rolls north. You will advance continuously, day and night, until you break through to Bastogne. I don't care what gets in your way. Smash through it, go around it, destroy it, but keep moving. The Germans expect us to attack carefully, methodically. We're going to attack like a tornado. When they think we're stopped, we'll keep coming. When they think they've held us, we'll break through. Because that's what Old Blood and Guts and his 3rd Army do." December 22nd, 1944. 0600 hours. The attack begins. Through the pre-dawn darkness and swirling snow, United States artillery opened fire. Hundreds of guns, carefully positioned during the night, pounded German positions. Then came the tanks, Shermans roaring forward through the snow, exhaust flames, bright in the darkness. General George Smith Patton stood on a hillside, watching his army attack, pearl-handled pistols at his belt, binoculars pressed to his eyes. Artillery shells screamed overhead. Tank engines thundered. This is what he lived for: battle, combat, leading men against the enemy. The German defenders fought back viciously. They'd had days to dig in, to prepare positions, to lay minefields. The 4th Armored Division hit them like a battering ram and recoiled, bloodied. Tanks burned. Infantry went to ground under heavy fire. At 3rd Army headquarters, staff officers monitored the battle with growing dread. The advance was stalling. They were taking heavy casualties. The Germans were too strong, too well positioned. But George Smith Patton never doubted. He drove forward to the front lines, to where his tanks were stopped by German anti-tank guns. "What's the holdup?" Old Blood and Guts demanded of the tank battalion commander. "Sir, heavy anti-tank fire from that ridge. We've lost 6 Shermans trying to advance." "Then stop going straight at them," Patton snapped. "Flank them, go around, use your infantry to suppress them. I don't care how you do it, but you take that ridge and you take it now." The battalion commander saluted and attacked again, this time coordinating with infantry, using artillery to blind the German gunners. The ridge fell, the advance continued. This is why they called him Old Blood and Guts. He didn't accept excuses. He didn't accept delays. He demanded results, and he got them. December 23rd, day 2 of the attack. The 4th Armored Division had punched 12 miles north, but at terrible cost. Every village was a fortress. Every crossroads was defended. The Germans were fighting with desperate courage, knowing that if the 3rd Army broke through to Bastogne, the entire German offensive would be jeopardized. And the weather was murderous. Blizzards reduced visibility to yards, tanks couldn't see targets, artillery couldn't spot fall of shot. Wounded men froze to death before medics could reach them. General George Smith Patton refused to let weather stop him. He drove up and down the front in his jeep, rallying his soldiers, pushing his commanders, demanding continuous attack. "The Germans have the same snow we do," Old Blood and Guts would shout. "They're just as cold, just as tired, but we're Americans, damn it. We're tougher. Now get moving." At Supreme Headquarters, they were losing faith. The attack was too slow, the casualties too heavy. Montgomery suggested pulling back, consolidating defenses. British officers calculated that at current rates of advance, Patton wouldn't reach Bastogne until after Christmas. Too late. But nobody told George Smith. Patton, he was too late. On the night of December 23rd, he gathered his exhausted commanders again. "Tomorrow we break through," Old Blood and Guts said flatly. "No, more excuses. No more delays. Tomorrow, Christmas Eve, we reach those men in Bastogne or die trying. Those are your orders. Dismissed." They stumbled out into the snow, too tired to argue, too inspired to quit. If George Smith Patton said they'd break through tomorrow, then somehow, impossibly, they'd break through tomorrow. December 24th, Christmas Eve, the moment of truth. The village of Chaumont stood between the 4th Armored Division and Bastogne, 5 miles. 5 miles of frozen hell defended by German paratroopers who'd sworn to die rather than retreat. If General George Smith Patton's army couldn't break through Chaumont, the men in Bastogne were doomed. At dawn on December 24th, Old Blood and Guts himself drove to the headquarters of Combat Command B, 4th Armored Division. The spearhead unit stalled before Chaumont. The exhausted officers looked up as George Smith Patton stormed into their command post. Uniform immaculate despite the conditions, pearl-handled pistols gleaming, eyes blazing with intensity. "Why aren't you moving?" Patton demanded. "Sir, the Germans have—" "I don't want to hear about what the Germans have," Old Blood and Guts cut him off. "I want to hear about what you're going to do to them. Those men in Bastogne have been surrounded for 8 days. 8 days of constant attack, no supplies, no reinforcements, running out of ammunition and medical supplies. They're counting on us. They're dying for us. And you're sitting here." The young lieutenant colonel commanding the combat unit straightened. "Sir, we'll attack immediately." "Damn right you will," General George Smith Patton said, "and I'm coming with you." This is why they called him Old Blood and Guts. While other generals commanded from safe headquarters miles behind the lines, George Smith Patton led from the front, sharing danger with his soldiers, inspiring them by his presence. The attack on Chaumont became legendary. United States tanks and infantry assaulted the village in a coordinated fury. German paratroopers fought back with fanatical determination. House-to-house combat raged through the morning. Casualties mounted terribly on both sides. And through it all, soldiers reported seeing General George Smith Patton himself, standing exposed to enemy fire, directing the battle, shouting encouragement, utterly fearless. Bullets snapped around him. Shells exploded nearby. Old blood and guts never flinched. "Keep pushing," Patton roared over the gunfire. "We're almost through. Don't stop now." By afternoon, Chaumont fell. The road to Bastogne lay open, but now came the final push. 5 miles through German-held territory, with darkness falling and enemy reinforcements rushing to block the breakthrough. "We go tonight," General George Smith Patton ordered. "Now. We don't wait for dawn. We don't consolidate. We drive straight through to Bastogne. Tonight." It violated every tactical principle. Night attacks were dangerous, disorganized, prone to friendly fire incidents. But Old Blood and Guts knew that hesitation would give the Germans time to seal the breach. Speed, audacity, violence. Those were Patton's principles. At 1600 hours on December 24th, the final attack began. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams led a tank column north from Chaumont, racing toward Bastogne through the gathering darkness. Behind him, infantry clung to the tanks, rifles ready, scanning for ambushes. German artillery fire rained down. Anti-tank guns opened up from hidden positions. The lead Sherman exploded. The second tank swerved around it and kept going. Enemy soldiers emerged from foxholes, firing Panzerfaust rockets at point-blank range. United States infantry jumped down and fought them with bayonets and rifle butts. But the column kept moving, kept pushing, getting closer to Bastogne with every yard. 2 miles. 1 mile. Half a mile. Inside the encircled perimeter at Bastogne, the defenders had held for 8 days against overwhelming odds. The 101st Airborne Division and attached units had been surrounded since December 20th, pounded by artillery, attacked constantly, running desperately low on ammunition and medical supplies. Men had died by the hundreds. The wounded lay in freezing cellars, medics operating by candlelight without proper supplies. But they'd held. When the German commander had sent a delegation demanding surrender on December 22nd, United States Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe had sent back a one-word reply that would become famous: nuts. Now, on the evening of December 24th, those exhausted defenders heard something impossible. Tank engines, growing louder, coming from the south. "It's Patton!" someone shouted. "Old Blood and Guts is coming!" Along the perimeter, exhausted soldiers stood in their frozen foxholes, staring south toward the sound of engines and gunfire. Was it possible? Could George Smith Patton actually have done it? 1645 hours. December 24th, 1944. The lead Sherman of Lieutenant Colonel Abrams's column smashed through the German encirclement and rolled into Bastogne. Behind it came more tanks, more infantry, more ammunition trucks. The siege was broken. In the gathering darkness of Christmas Eve, surrounded soldiers emerged from their positions, cheering, crying, embracing their rescuers. Some fell to their knees in the snow, thanking God. Officers shook hands with tears streaming down frozen faces. General McAuliffe, the defender of Bastogne, met the relief column with a weary smile. "How are you, Colonel?" "Gee, I'm mighty glad to see you," Abrams replied, his voice thick with emotion. Behind the front lines, when the radio message came through that the 4th Armored Division had reached Bastogne, General George Smith Patton allowed himself a tight smile. He'd done it. Against every prediction, against impossible odds, against the doubts of every other Allied commander, Old Blood and Guts had done exactly what he'd promised. He'd moved an army 100 miles through winter weather in 72 hours. He'd attacked the strongest German offensive since 1940. He'd broken through 5 enemy divisions. He'd relieved Bastogne on Christmas Eve. "Get me Eisenhower," Patton told his communications officer. When the Supreme Commander came on the line, George Smith Patton said simply, "The relief of Bastogne is complete. 3rd Army is in the town. The Germans are retreating. Merry Christmas." There was a long pause. Then Eisenhower's voice came through, thick with emotion and exhaustion and relief. "George, I don't know how you did it, but thank God you did." Old Blood and Guts had done it again. The relief of Bastogne marked the turning point of the Battle of the Bulge. With the Third Army now attacking from the south, with the surrounded garrison freed and reinforced, with supply lines restored, the German offensive was doomed. Hitler's last great gamble had failed, smashed against the courage of United States soldiers and the tactical genius of General George Smith Patton. In the days following Christmas, the Allied counteroffensive intensified. George Smith Patton's Third Army drove north and east, pushing the Germans back, eliminating the Bulge, inflicting catastrophic casualties on enemy units that had advanced too far. By the end of January 1945, the battle was over. The Germans had lost over 100,000 men, 800 tanks, and thousands of vehicles. More importantly, they'd lost their last offensive capability. From this point forward, Nazi Germany could only retreat toward inevitable defeat, but the cost had been terrible. The United States Army suffered over 80,000 casualties in the Battle of the Bulge, killed, wounded, or captured. Entire divisions had been mauled. The Ardennes villages were graveyards of burned-out tanks and frozen corpses. Still, it could have been so much worse. If General George Smith Patton hadn't predicted the attack, hadn't prepared for it, hadn't executed the impossible relief of Bastogne, the German breakthrough might have reached the Meuse River, might have captured Antwerp, might have split the Allied armies and prolonged the war by months or even years. The other Allied commanders who had doubted Old Blood and Guts now scrambled to praise him. Montgomery, who'd laughed at the idea of attacking in 72 hours, sent a terse congratulatory message. Bradley called the maneuver one of the most brilliant operations of the war. Even the cautious Eisenhower admitted that George Smith Patton's tactical instincts had been vindicated completely. But the most telling praise came from the enemy. Captured German officers, when interrogated about the battle, spoke of General George Smith Patton with a mixture of fear and respect that bordered on awe. "We knew Patton was in the south," one German general said during his interrogation. "We thought we had time before he could reach the battlefield. How did he move so fast? How did he know we were coming?" Another captured officer was more direct. "If all your generals fought like Patton, we would have lost this war in 1943. Thank God for your other commanders." Even Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the overall German commander in the West, admitted after the war that George Smith Patton was the Allied general the Wehrmacht feared most. "Patton was the most dangerous man you had. Fast, aggressive, unpredictable. When we heard his Third Army was moving toward a sector, we knew we were in for a fight." The German High Command had made a fatal miscalculation. They'd assumed that even if the Allies detected their Ardennes offensive, it would take weeks for reinforcements to arrive. They'd based their entire timetable on conventional military wisdom about how long it takes to move large formations in winter conditions. They hadn't counted on Old Blood and Guts. Back in the United States, newspapers proclaimed George Smith Patton a national hero. Time magazine put him on the cover with the headline, "Patton of the Bulge." Radio broadcasts described the relief of Bastogne in breathless detail. American civilians, who'd been horrified by initial reports of the German offensive, now celebrated the dramatic rescue as evidence that the United States Army was invincible. But General George Smith Patton didn't bask in glory. While others celebrated, he was already planning his next offensive. The war wasn't over. Germany still had to be invaded, conquered, and occupied. Old Blood and Guts had more fighting to do. In late January 1945, Patton visited the 101st Airborne Division, the men who'd held Bastogne against impossible odds. He toured their positions, saw the frozen foxholes where they'd fought, the cellars where surgeons had operated on the wounded by candlelight. He met with the officers and soldiers, shaking hands, offering congratulations. When someone thanked George Smith Patton for saving them, Old Blood and Guts shook his head. "You saved yourselves," Patton said gruffly. "You held when anyone else would have surrendered. All the Third Army did was open the door. You men, you're the real heroes of Bastogne." But the soldiers of the 101st knew the truth. Without George Smith Patton's prediction, without his preparation, without his impossible forced march and violent breakthrough, they would have died in that frozen town. Old Blood and Guts had saved 10,000 lives through sheer force of will and tactical brilliance. The Battle of the Bulge vindicated everything George Smith Patton believed about warfare. Speed, aggression, audacity, those were the keys to victory. While other generals calculated and hesitated and planned cautiously, Old Blood and Guts struck like lightning. While others worried about supply lines and rest periods and safe flanks, Patton trusted in movement and violence and shock. Most importantly, the battle proved that George Smith Patton's instincts were better than any intelligence report. While analysis and reconnaissance had failed to detect the German buildup, while experts had dismissed the possibility of a major offensive, Old Blood and Guts had seen the truth. He'd studied his enemy, understood their desperation, predicted their strategy, and he'd been the only one who saw it coming. Today, more than 80 years after General George Smith Patton predicted the German Ardennes offensive and executed the relief of Bastogne, military historians and strategists still study what happened in that frozen December of 1944. The maneuver itself, moving an entire Army Corps 90 degrees in 72 hours during winter conditions, remains unmatched in military history. No army before or since has executed such a rapid, large-scale redeployment under combat conditions. Modern war colleges use it as the textbook example of operational flexibility and aggressive leadership. But more significant than the maneuver was the prediction. Why was General George Smith Patton the only Allied commander who saw the German attack coming? The answer lies in understanding what made Old Blood and Guts different from every other general in the United States Army. George Smith Patton was a student of military history stretching back to ancient times. He'd read everything from Julius Caesar's Gallic Wars to Napoleon's campaigns to his own experiences in World War I. He understood warfare not just as a profession, but as an art, a science, a calling. While other generals studied current intelligence reports, Patton studied the eternal principles of strategy and tactics. He understood psychology, his own soldiers' psychology, his enemy's psychology, the psychology of warfare itself. Old Blood and Guts knew that a cornered enemy fights desperately. He knew that Hitler, facing inevitable defeat, would gamble everything on one last offensive. He knew that military logic would dictate attacking through the weakest point in Allied lines, the Ardennes. Most importantly, General George Smith Patton trusted his instincts. When every intelligence analyst said there was no threat, when every other general dismissed his concerns, when all the data pointed to German weakness, Old Blood and Guts listened to his warriors' intuition and prepared for battle. That combination, historical knowledge, psychological insight, tactical genius, and warrior instinct, made George Smith Patton the greatest combat commander the United States Army has ever produced. The relief of Bastogne became the defining moment of his career. All the controversies that had plagued him earlier, the slapping incidents, the conflicts with superiors, the political missteps, were forgotten in the glory of that December campaign. Old Blood and Guts had saved an army and changed the course of the war. Today at the United States Military Academy at West Point, cadets still study the Battle of the Bulge and George Smith Patton's role in it. They analyze his prediction, his preparation, his execution. They learn that sometimes the greatest military skill isn't following doctrine or obeying conventional wisdom. It's seeing what others can't see and having the courage to act on that vision. At the National Infantry Museum at Fort Benning, Georgia, visitors can see exhibits dedicated to General George Smith Patton and his Third Army. Maps show the incredible movement from the Saar region to the Ardennes. Photographs display Old Blood and Guts standing with his soldiers in the snow. Testimonials from survivors describe what it meant when Patton's tanks rolled into Bastogne on Christmas Eve. And in Bastogne itself, in Belgium, monuments commemorate the battle. The Martyrs' Memorial lists the names of American soldiers who fought there. The Bastogne War Museum tells the story of the siege and relief. Every December, ceremonies honor the defenders and liberators. But perhaps the most fitting tribute to General George Smith Patton doesn't exist in any museum or monument. It exists in the lives he saved, 10,000 soldiers who came home from Bastogne because Old Blood and Guts refused to accept the impossible. It exists in the military doctrine that still teaches his principles of speed, aggression, and audacity. It exists in the legend of a general who wore pearl-handled pistols, delivered profane speeches, led from the front, and saw the future when everyone else was blind. They called him Old Blood and Guts. They called him a glory seeker, a showman, a madman. But when it mattered, most, when thousands of American lives hung in the balance, George Smith Patton was the one man who saw the danger coming and the one man who could do something about it. On December 16, 1944, while every other Allied commander believed the war was nearly won, General George Smith Patton stood alone with his terrifying prediction. And when hell erupted in the Ardennes forest exactly as he'd foreseen, Old Blood and Guts was ready. He moved an army through a blizzard. He attacked through impossible terrain. He broke through 5 German divisions. He relieved Bastogne in 96 hours exactly as he'd promised. And in doing so, George Smith Patton proved why he was not just a great general, but a military genius whose vision, courage, and will to victory will inspire warriors for generations to come. This is why they called him Old Blood and Guts. This is why the United States needed him. This is why the legend of General George Smith Patton will never die. If this story of how Old Blood and Guts predicted the German attack, executed the impossible, and saved 10,000 lives moved you, hit that subscribe button right now. We're bringing you more untold stories of General George Smith Patton, the battles, the controversies, the moments of brilliance that made him history's greatest combat commander. Next week, we'll reveal what happened when Patton faced Rommel in North Africa, the clash of titans that changed desert warfare forever. Don't miss it. Subscribe now and witness greatness.